On the night of July 18, 2010, 34-year-old former NBA basketball player Lorenzen Wright, along with his old friend Phil Dotson, were driving in Phil's car through Memphis, Tennessee. Lorenzen lived in Atlanta, Georgia, but he'd grown up in Memphis, and so he was back in town to catch up with friends and family, and to really spend some time with his 6 children who lived there with his ex-wife, Shara. Phil and Lorenzen drove down a residential street, laughing together and talking about some of their best memories from when they were younger, and then Phil pulled into the parking lot of a local gym and parked out front. As Lorenzen got outside the car, he had to duck way down so he didn't bump his head on the roof of the car. Lorenzen was huge. He was 6 foot 11 inches tall, with long arms covered in tattoos. And even though he was retired from playing basketball professionally, he was still built like a world-class athlete. Lorenzen and Phil made their way into the gym and headed towards one of the basketball courts inside, where a group of teenage boys were playing a pickup game. And as Lorenzen got closer, he heard the sound of a basketball hitting the rim, and the boys shouting at each other and shoes squeaking on the court as the boys scrambled to grab the loose ball, and immediately Lorenzen smiled, because he loved the sound of basketball being played. Lorenzen and Phil moved around to the side of the court and sat down to watch the game. And as they sat there, Lorenzen began to smile even wider because he noticed his oldest son was one of the young men who was playing. Lorenzen didn't want to distract any of the kids, so he stepped back a little from the court and tried his best to stay out of sight. But at almost 7 feet tall, there was no way for him to hide. And so eventually one of the boys spotted him and shouted Lorenzen's name, and immediately the game came to a complete stop. And within seconds, Lorenzen's son and all the other boys rushed off the court, gathered around Lorenzen, and stared up at him in awe, because Lorenzen was a Memphis sports hero. Lorenzen's friends and family believed that he had been born to play basketball. His father had been a really good college player, and from the time Lorenzen was just a baby, his father had wanted him to follow in his footsteps. In fact, when Lorenzen was only a few days old and had only just come home from the hospital, his father had put Lorenzen's hands around a basketball, because his father believed that the more his son saw the basketball, the more likely it would be that Lorenzen would grow up to become a great basketball player. And as Lorenzen got older, he didn't let his father down. As a young man, Lorenzen had committed most of his time and energy to playing basketball. And when he grew to be 6 foot 11 inches as a teenager, his father and his coaches started to believe Lorenzen had a real chance to play professionally. Lorenzen would have an incredible senior year playing for his Memphis high school basketball team, and then he would go on to play college ball at the big-time program of the University of Memphis. But even on this big college team of all great players from around the country, Lorenzen stood out. And he was so good that after just his sophomore year, he left college, entered the NBA draft, and got drafted by the Los Angeles Clippers. So, at just 20 years old, Lorenzen had become an NBA player and had started making millions and millions of dollars a year. But Lorenzen's biggest joy playing professional basketball, even more than the money and the accolades, had come when he got traded to the Memphis Grizzlies in 2001, and he got to come home and play in the city he grew up in and loved. And even after Lorenzen had retired from the NBA several years later, he had made his home in Memphis with his wife and kids. And in his retirement, he quickly began running basketball camps for kids, he headed up charity events, and basically did anything he could to give back to the city that he believed had given him so much. So, as Lorenzen stood in that gym, talking to his son and his son's friends about basketball and playing in the NBA and anything else they wanted to know, he couldn't help but start to really miss living in Memphis. After talking to the kids on the basketball court for a while, Lorenzen and his son headed out of the gym with Phil, and Phil drove them to Lorenzen's ex-wife Shara's house in a wealthy Memphis suburb. Outside the house, Lorenzen thanked Phil for driving him around, and then he told Phil he'd text him in the next few days so they could hang out again before Lorenzen had to go back to Atlanta. Then Lorenzen and his son turned around and headed up a long walkway past the beautifully landscaped front lawn, opened the front door, and stepped into Shara's large 2-story house. And as soon as Lorenzen walked inside, he heard his other children yelling for him as they rushed to the door to see their dad. And Lorenzen crouched down and wrapped his long arms all around them in a big hug. And that night, Lorenzen just spent time talking to his kids, playing games with them, and catching up with Shara about what was going on in her life. Lorenzen had known Shara since they were in high school. She was the daughter of one of his basketball coaches at the time, and she was a few years older than Lorenzen. Shara was 5 foot 10 inches tall, had long dark hair, and, in Lorenzen's mind, a perfect smile. And when Lorenzen had first laid eyes on her, he thought she was one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen. And so, not long after they met, Lorenzen and Shara had started dating, and then they had basically grown up together, while Lorenzen went from being a college athlete to playing in the NBA. And for a long time, everything in their lives had seemed perfect. But then, after 13 years of marriage, Shara and Lorenzen had started to drift apart, and eventually they had gotten divorced, and Lorenzen had moved to Atlanta. But even after the divorce, Lorenzen and Shara remained close, and they worked hard to give their kids the best life possible. And whenever Lorenzen came to town, he always stayed with Shara and the kids at her house. So, sitting on the couch together, Shara and Lorenzen began to work out plans for their kids to go down to Atlanta with Lorenzen when he left later that week. And then Lorenzen told Shara he really wanted to hear all about the church, where she had recently started serving as a pastor. Shara had always been religious, but she admitted to Lorenzen that it was actually really hard to lead a congregation. But she said she did love being a pastor, and she loved the church and the people who went there. And as they talked, again, Lorenzen felt this sudden wave of just really missing Memphis, and now really missing being a part of this family, living with his kids and living with Shara. And suddenly, all he wanted to do was find a way to repair his relationship with Shara and move back in with her permanently in Memphis. And Lorenzen suspected that that actually might be a real possibility because Shara had made it clear that she missed him too. So later that night, when Lorenzen said goodnight to the kids as they headed up to bed, he imagined a time, hopefully soon, when this would be his everyday life again. A little before midnight on July 18th, 2010, so a couple of hours after the kids had gone to bed, Lorenzen crept downstairs at Shara's house in the dark. He slid his hand down the banister, took slow steps, and tried to walk as quietly as possible so he wouldn't wake anybody up. Lorenzen made it to the first floor, he walked across the large entryway, he opened the front door, and stepped outside. And once he was outside, he closed the door behind him as quietly as possible. Outside, Lorenzen could already feel sweat dripping down his forehead. Even though it was almost midnight, the temperature was over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Lorenzen wiped the sweat away and then looked out across the yard, and he saw a car pull up out front. Lorenzen glanced back at the house where his kids and Shara were sleeping, and then he turned and walked quickly to the car, opened the passenger side door, ducked way down, and climbed inside. The driver smiled at him, and then they pulled away from the house. And less than a half hour later, not long after midnight on the morning of July 19th, Lorenzen looked out the passenger side window and he watched the lights from Memphis disappear behind them. And soon after that, the driver turned the car onto a road that was surrounded by woods on both sides, and that was about 15 miles south of downtown Memphis. Then, after looking in the rearview mirror to make sure nobody was behind them, the driver pulled onto a dirt path that led into the woods. They drove the car only a few yards down that path before they stopped and parked the car. Then the driver looked over at Lorenzen, nodded to him, and then the driver stepped out of the car. So Lorenzen ducked down and stepped out of the car as well, and began to follow the driver, who was walking deeper and deeper into the forest. And as Lorenzen walked, he could almost feel the trees closing in on him. Then Lorenzen heard a rustling sound in the trees ahead of them. He and the driver froze for a moment, and Lorenzen strained his eyes to try to see what had made the noise. But it was so dark, Lorenzen just couldn't tell what it was. And so a moment later, the driver and Lorenzen were walking again, but just a second later, Lorenzen heard the sound again. But this time, Lorenzen saw what was causing the noise, and he saw it was coming straight towards him. And so suddenly, in a terrified panic, Lorenzen darted off the dirt path, grabbed his phone out of his pocket, put his head down, and just started running as fast as he could into the dark woods. On July 22nd, so 3 days after Lorenzen had gone into the woods, his friend Phil Dotson was sitting on the couch at home watching TV when his phone rang. Phil grabbed his phone, thinking it might be Lorenzen, but he saw Shara was calling. Phil had been waiting to hear back from Lorenzen so they could maybe hang out again before Lorenzen went back to Atlanta, but he knew Lorenzen was busy with the kids and seeing his parents, so he hadn't thought much about it. But as soon as he answered the phone, he could tell something was wrong. Because when Shara heard Phil's voice, she didn't even say hi. She just immediately asked if he had seen or heard from Lorenzen. Phil was totally confused and told Shara he didn't understand because he thought Lorenzen was staying with her and her kids. She said that he had, but a few nights earlier, Lorenzen had left the house to meet up with someone and he had never come back. Shara didn't say anything about this meetup, but Phil secretly wondered if she thought Lorenzen had gone to meet up with a woman, because since the divorce, Lorenzen often had a few different women he was seeing at one time. But Shara just said she thought it was strange that it had been a couple of days now and that Lorenzen had not called to at least check on the kids. Phil said he agreed and that he would try to track Lorenzen down. So Phil hung up and immediately called Lorenzen. And when Lorenzen didn't answer, Phil sent him a text saying that it was really important for Lorenzen to get back to him as soon as possible. After that, Phil called Lorenzen's mom, and it turned out she hadn't heard from him either. And she was getting really worried too and thought something was wrong, and she was thinking about calling the police. Phil tried to keep her calm, but he knew it was no use. Lorenzen's mom was maybe closer to Lorenzen than anybody in the world, and if she was worried about her son, nobody could say anything to change her mind. After several more hours of not hearing anything from Lorenzen and discovering that no friends or family had heard from him since he left Shara's house a few nights earlier, Phil wound up calling Lorenzen's mom back again, and he told her that he too was now very worried. So Lorenzen's mom called the police in the suburb where Shara lived and reported that her son was missing. But the police response was not nearly as urgent as the people close to Lorenzen had hoped it would be. And over the next few days, there didn't seem to be any real progress made in trying to find Lorenzen. But the police would say that they had no reason to believe there was any foul play involved in Lorenzen's supposed disappearance, which was part of the reason why there was not a lot of urgency here. But Lorenzen's mom kept calling the police over and over and over again, asking for updates and putting pressure on them, and she even contacted the press. She said her son was a former professional basketball star who was 6'11" tall, and so it just didn't make any sense that nobody had seen or recognized him over the past few days. And then finally, on July 27th, so 8 days after Lorenzen had gone into the woods, Memphis police took over the case, because they had been notified about a 911 call that had been received by a small-town emergency dispatcher early in the morning on July 19th, not that long after Lorenzen had left Shara's house. The 911 dispatcher said the call had been dropped so quickly that they couldn't locate where it was coming from at the time. But Memphis police still didn't understand why nobody had done anything to follow up on that call until over a week after it had been made. Still, there was no use arguing over what could or should have been done, and now Memphis police just wanted to figure out if this 911 call was connected to their missing hometown hero, Lorenzen Wright. And using cell phone tracking data, Memphis police were able to trace the 911 call to Lorenzen's phone number, and they discovered the call had come from somewhere either in or close to the woods, located about 15 miles outside of downtown Memphis. On July 28th, 9 days after Lorenzen had last been seen by anyone, Memphis police officers and police dogs searched the woods and fields in the general location where they believed the 911 call had come from, and what they were looking for were any clues that might lead them to Lorenzen. The sun was blazing overhead, and members of the search party who were looking through an open field near the woods were hot, exhausted, and frustrated that they had not found anything. Then suddenly, one of the police dogs caught a scent. It put its nose to the ground and started off through the field, and the officer, who was the dog's handler, followed close behind. The dog pushed its way through some dried grass and then came to a stop and started barking. And the dog's handler crouched down to get a better look at whatever the dog had discovered, and when the officer saw what was on the ground, his stomach began to turn. The officer had been at a number of crime scenes, but nothing in his past had prepared him for what he was looking at on the ground right in front of him. He was sure it was a human body, and from the looks of it, there could be bullet wounds on it. But the summer heat and the natural elements had withered the body down to almost nothing, so it was basically just bones and only a little bit of weathered skin, which made it impossible to tell who this person was. The officer stepped back from the body and took a deep breath. Then he called out to the others on the scene, and they quickly joined him and his dog. And then the officer called into the station to say the search party believed they had discovered a murder scene. Not long after that call, forensics and ballistics experts swarmed the area and combed the scene for evidence. And by the end of the day, they had located multiple shell casings from a 9mm pistol not far from the body. However, they couldn't find a gun. And later, the body was finally removed from the field and taken to the coroner. And during the autopsy, the body only weighed about 55 pounds. But dental records confirmed that the victim was the 6'11", 225-pound former professional basketball player, Lorenzen Wright. The news of Lorenzen's death sent the city of Memphis into shock, and some of his former NBA teammates, community leaders, and closest friends like Phil Dotson went on TV to express how upset they were. And all of them talked about how good of a person Lorenzen had been and how much of a loss this really was. But nobody was as heartbroken as Lorenzen's mother. She went on the local news to talk about how amazing her son was and to beg anyone who had information about what had happened to Lorenzen to come forward and share it with police. And so it quickly became clear to Memphis Police Director Tony Armstrong that his department was dealing with one of its most high-profile cases in years. And so Armstrong decided to get directly involved in the investigation because he wanted to make sure everything was done by the book. But Armstrong also wanted to be involved because he had really liked Lorenzen. Over the years, Lorenzen had been a part of so many community programs and charity fundraisers in Memphis that Armstrong had seen him speak on multiple occasions. And Armstrong thought Lorenzen had been a great role model for young people and that he demonstrated how someone should use their money and fame to better the lives of those around them. And so Armstrong wanted to close the case as quickly as possible so he would be able to tell the people of Memphis that police had found justice for one of their city's heroes. But Armstrong felt like his investigative team was already starting at a disadvantage because the fact that Lorenzen's 911 call had gone unreported for over a week meant that vital evidence at the scene could have been wiped away by the elements. And the killer had been given ample time to travel anywhere in the world before the body was even discovered. But regardless of all that, Armstrong and his lead detectives first had to try to figure out why a former NBA star, who was worth millions of dollars, had gone into the woods in the middle of the night. And so, on August 1st, 4 days after Lorenzen's body had been found, Armstrong and members of his team headed to Shara's house in the suburbs. And after investigators did a thorough search of the house, Armstrong asked if Shara would mind answering some questions to see if she could help police piece together what had happened on the night Lorenzen had left her house and didn't come back. Shara said she would answer anything she could, so she led Armstrong and a detective into the dining room, and they all sat down at the table, and then Armstrong asked her what she remembered about the night Lorenzen disappeared. Shara looked around the room, and then in a quiet voice, she said she didn't want any of the children to hear what she was about to say. Armstrong glanced over at the other detective, and both men nodded and then leaned in close to listen to Shara. And when she started talking, Armstrong's eyes got wide, and he looked like he was in shock. Shara said in a whisper that a little before midnight on July 18th, Lorenzen had gotten a phone call, and he had started pacing around her bedroom, and he was excited and talking loudly to the person on the other line, and she heard him say something about making $110,000 really fast. And at first, Shara had no idea what he was talking about. But then Lorenzen had hung up the phone and walked over to the bags he'd brought with him to the house, and Shara had watched as Lorenzen reached into one of the bags and pulled out a stash of drugs and a wad of cash. She had asked him what was going on, but Lorenzen just said he had some work he needed to take care of. And then he had put the drugs in a box, pocketed the cash, walked out of the room, and headed downstairs. And not long after that, Shara had heard a car driving away from the house. At the dining room table, Armstrong and the detective sat there with stunned looks still on their faces because Shara's story just made no sense to them. Armstrong knew that Lorenzen had made close to $55 million during his basketball career, and he owned multiple properties in different cities. And Armstrong couldn't understand why a man with that kind of wealth would have anything to do with dealing drugs, or why he would need to make some fast money. And so Armstrong asked Shara if she was really sure about what she had heard and seen that night, and Shara just nodded and said, "Yes, I'm sure." Then Shara looked around again to make sure none of her kids were close by, and in barely above a whisper, she told them that she felt terrible for what she was about to say, and she hoped it would not ruin their image of Lorenzen. But Armstrong said if she had important information, they needed to hear it no matter what it was. So Shara looked Armstrong in the eye and told him that Lorenzen had blown almost all of the money he'd made from playing in the NBA. She said he'd used a lot of it to help friends and family because he was a good man who could never say no to people who asked him for help. But she said he'd also had trouble controlling his own spending, especially when it came to buying luxury cars and properties. And then she said at least one of Lorenzen's houses was going into foreclosure because he couldn't make the mortgage payments. And so, recently, Lorenzen had begun selling drugs to make ends meet. Armstrong thanked Shara for talking to them and said police would be in touch with her if they needed anything else. Then Armstrong and the other detective headed out of the house, got in their cars, and drove back to the station. And when he got there, Armstrong could not help but feel like this case had already taken a turn he did not see coming. At the police station, Armstrong met with the investigators who had searched Shara's house, and they told him that they had not found anything of interest there. So Armstrong stepped into his office and sat down at his desk. He still couldn't get over what Shara had told him. Her story just did not reflect who Armstrong thought Lorenzen was, a young man who went out of his way to give back to the community whenever he could. But Armstrong knew that the fame and fortune of professional athletes was a world he could never fully understand. And so he put his personal feelings aside, and over the next couple of days, he and his team started looking into any connections Lorenzen might have had to known drug dealers in the area, and what Armstrong discovered shocked him all over again. It turned out that in 2009, a year before Lorenzen's body was found in the woods, he had been mentioned in an FBI investigation involving an international drug smuggling ring that had been operating out of Memphis. Armstrong learned that Lorenzen had never been charged with any crimes based on that investigation, but that investigation showed there was a possibility that Lorenzen had ties to one of the largest cocaine dealers in Memphis. And so all of a sudden, Shara's story started to make a lot of sense. And Armstrong also discovered that one of Lorenzen's homes was indeed going into foreclosure, just like Shara had said. And so now Armstrong believed that the chance to make a lot of money from a drug deal could definitely explain what Lorenzen had been doing in the woods the night he died. So the Memphis police decided to focus in on this new potential lead and to track down the big-time cocaine dealer who Lorenzen had possibly known. On August 4th, 2010, a week after Lorenzen's body was discovered, Armstrong and his team were still following leads that might connect Lorenzen to a large-scale drug operation in Memphis. But while the police were at work, hundreds of Lorenzen's fans, teammates, friends, and family gathered at the arena where the Memphis Grizzlies play basketball for Lorenzen's memorial service. Shara, the children, and Lorenzen's parents led a long procession across the arena floor to Lorenzen's closed silver casket. Each of Lorenzen's children wore a cap with a logo on it from one of the NBA teams Lorenzen had played for, and they all took a moment to say their last goodbyes to their dad. The memorial service was a chance for Memphis to celebrate and honor one of their most loved sports figures, and the service was even televised on local channels for people who could not attend in person. And during the memorial, Lorenzen's mom was visibly shaken and too upset to speak at times, so Lorenzen's younger brother did most of the talking for the family. And he told the crowd how much they all had loved Lorenzen and how proud they were of everything he had accomplished. And then, as he fought back tears, he said he'd always thought his big brother was invincible, so he couldn't believe Lorenzen was now gone. Not long after Lorenzen's brother finished speaking, the mayor of Memphis stepped up to the mic, and he promised Lorenzen's family and everyone in the arena that authorities would track down whoever had killed Lorenzen, and they would bring that person to justice. And in the days following that memorial service, Police Director Armstrong felt the pressure building on his investigative team. Lorenzen's murder was now national news, and local news ran stories on Lorenzen and asked for updates on the investigation constantly. And in addition to that, the mayor had just made a public claim that the killer would soon be brought to justice. But all of the added pressure did not mean Memphis police would get any closer to solving the case, and Armstrong's team could only follow the leads they had. So, based on what Shara had told them, and on information from the past FBI investigation, Memphis police continued to aggressively pursue any leads that could tie Lorenzen to the drug trade in Memphis. But they quickly discovered that the cocaine dealer Lorenzen possibly had links to had been in prison at the time of Lorenzen's murder, and police couldn't find any evidence connecting Lorenzen to any other known drug dealers in the area. And so this drug deal theory that police hoped would lead them right to Lorenzen's killer ended up leading them nowhere. And now Armstrong found himself back at square one. And so Armstrong sent his investigators back out to the crime scene to look for more evidence, but throughout all those new searches, they didn't find anything new. All they had were the shell casings that had been found when the body had been found, and that was it. So, without anything to go on, Armstrong just re-interviewed Lorenzen's friend Phil, Lorenzen's ex-wife Shara, and all of Lorenzen's closest family members and friends, but they didn't find anything new in those conversations either. And so, even as pressure continued to mount on the police from the public, the victim's friends and family, and Memphis politicians, Lorenzen's murder case started to go cold, and it stayed that way for years. In the summer of 2012, 2 years after Lorenzen's body was found, his mother decided to go on a public crusade to find justice for her son. Over time, she had watched Lorenzen's story fade from the news, and she had seen the investigation into his murder almost completely stall out, and there was no way she was going to stand for that. And so she started reaching out to local and national press and talking to anybody in the media who would listen. And she told them that she wouldn't just let Lorenzen's memory be forgotten. And she demanded that the police do their job and find Lorenzen's killer. And she said as long as she had blood running through her veins, she was going to keep fighting until her son could finally rest in peace. Now, Director Armstrong saw all of this happening, and he knew that Lorenzen's mom and others in the Memphis community were angry at him and the police for not being able to solve this case. And so Armstrong tried to jumpstart the investigation by assigning a series of new lead detectives to the case, but unfortunately, none of them made any headway. And as more time went by with no new leads and seemingly no hope, Lorenzen's mom started to feel like nobody cared about this case anymore. But then, after years of the investigation barely moving forward, Memphis police would finally catch a break that seemed to come completely out of nowhere. Fast forward to January of 2015, almost 5 years after Lorenzen's murder. Lorenzen's mom continued her media crusade, but she felt like she was the only one who was still fighting for her son. But on a cold winter afternoon, Armstrong was sitting in his office when one of his detectives walked in. This detective had an excited look on his face, and he started talking really fast. And Armstrong looked up and said, wait, what's going on here? What's going on? And the detective slowed down and then just said there was a novel that had just been published that Armstrong had to read. Armstrong stared at the detective like this might be some kind of prank, because he couldn't understand why any new book would warrant this much excitement. But then, the detective told him that even though the book was fiction, he thought it might be connected to the murder of Lorenzen Wright. Armstrong just sat there in silence for a minute. He never imagined he'd have to turn to a work of fiction for possible evidence in a 5-year-long murder investigation. But soon after this meeting, Armstrong and other members of the investigative team read parts of this new book. And what they found didn't provide any hard proof about what had happened to Lorenzen, but it did spark their interest in one particular suspect. And eventually, that newfound interest would help lead to a full-scale relaunch of the investigation, and with more resources behind them, Memphis police would finally uncover who had killed Lorenzen years earlier in the woods. Based on evidence found throughout the investigation, cell phone data, and interviews conducted over the course of 7 years, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Lorenzen Wright on the day he died, July 19, 2010. Just after midnight on July 19, 2010, the killer stood behind a tree at the end of a dirt path leading into the woods. The heat and their own nerves were making the killer sweat, so they wiped their hands dry on the side of their black pants, then they drew a 9mm pistol from their waistband and clutched it tight. Then the killer saw headlights cutting through the darkness, and they heard a car slowly driving towards them. The car parked a few yards away, and the killer saw the driver step outside. Then they watched Lorenzen get out of the car on the passenger side. Even in the darkness, Lorenzen looked huge, and the killer felt a little bit afraid. So the killer took a steadying breath and then huddled a little bit closer to the tree. A moment later, the driver began walking down the path towards the killer, and Lorenzen followed them. So the killer, at this point, squinted in the darkness and stepped out from their hiding place and raised their gun right at Lorenzen. But the killer hesitated. And when Lorenzen saw this person with the gun standing there, Lorenzen immediately grabbed his phone, turned off the path, and started running deep into the woods. The killer fired the gun at Lorenzen, but they missed, so they took off running after Lorenzen. But Lorenzen was so fast, it was almost impossible for the killer to even stay close. But the killer could see the light from Lorenzen's phone, and so they just kept following that light, and they fired another shot generally in the direction of the phone. Then the woods started to clear, and the moonlight and stars made it easier for the killer to see what was ahead of them and to keep Lorenzen in their sight. And then the killer heard Lorenzen shouting into his phone, desperately asking the police for help. And so the killer fired off a few more shots, and Lorenzen stopped talking, but he kept running. The killer could feel a pain in their side, and they were gasping for air by this point, but they kept pushing as hard as they could to try to keep up with Lorenzen. Then the killer saw Lorenzen running towards a high barbed wire fence that separated the woods from a field on the other side. And the killer just watched, dumbfounded, as Lorenzen leapt clear over the fence in stride. But as Lorenzen jumped, he must have caught his back foot on the fence, because when he landed, he fell to the ground and kind of tumbled forward. And the killer knew this was likely their only chance, so they ran as fast as they could towards the fence, and when they saw Lorenzen trying to get back up, they fired multiple shots through the opening in the barbed wire. And the killer heard Lorenzen scream, and they saw him fall to the ground again. Then the killer managed to get over the barbed wire fence to the other side, and once they got there, they saw Lorenzen laying on the ground, bleeding and struggling to breathe. The killer stood there for a moment, watching Lorenzen. Then they took a deep breath, aimed their pistol at Lorenzen's chest, and they fired. Then they raised their gun slightly and aimed it at Lorenzen's face, and they fired again. At this point, Lorenzen's body went limp, and he died right there in the field. The killer stood over Lorenzen's body, and they felt like they wanted to throw up. But they took another deep breath, turned around, made their way back over the barbed wire fence, and back into the dark woods. And finally, after what felt like hours, but had only been a few minutes, the killer found their way back to the dirt path and saw that the car was still parked there. Then they heard something behind them, and the driver of the car stepped out of the darkness and approached the killer. The driver asked if it was done, and the killer just nodded and said yes. So the driver smiled, climbed back into their car, and drove back home. And when they got inside their house, the driver went from room to room, checking on all 6 of their sleeping children. Lorenzen's ex-wife, Shara, had not actually pulled the trigger, but she was the one behind Lorenzen's murder. She had hired a deacon at the church where she was a pastor to kill her ex-husband. Because it would turn out that Shara was the one who really had the huge spending problem. And she had decided that the $26,000 a month that Lorenzen paid in alimony and child support was not enough money for her to live on, and she wanted the payout from Lorenzen's $1 million life insurance policy and his sizable pension from the MBA. So Shara had decided Lorenzen needed to die. And it turned out that Lorenzen had been right to believe he had a real chance to repair his marriage with Shara and to move back in with his family in Memphis, because Shara had told him how much she missed him. But that wasn't all she had done. In the days leading up to the murder, she had sent Lorenzen a series of sexually explicit text messages telling him how badly she wanted him back. And she had used those messages to lure Lorenzen from Atlanta back to Memphis. And so, late at night on July 18th, 2010, when Lorenzen was staying with Shara in her bedroom, she told him that she had to go meet someone who owed her money. But she said she didn't really want to go alone because they were meeting outside of the city. And so Lorenzen said he would go with her, and that's how Shara had gotten Lorenzen out to the woods where the gunman was waiting for him. Shara knew that Lorenzen had been mentioned in an investigation concerning a drug smuggling ring, and even though Lorenzen had never been found guilty of any crime in that case, she figured if she told police Lorenzen had been dealing drugs, they would discover the past investigation and come to believe the murder was indeed drug-related. And for years, it looked like Shara was going to get away with it. But then, in 2015, she had decided to become an author, and so she self-published a novel. And Shara barely disguised the fact that she wanted people who read the book to believe it was about her own life. And in the book, the main character is married to a basketball player who was abusive, violent, and a terrible husband. So when Armstrong and other investigators read the book, they thought it came off like an attack on Lorenzen. And even though nobody is killed in this book, some investigators thought that at times the book read like Shara was trying to justify Lorenzen's murder. Now, the police were not going to use a work of fiction as proof of Shara's guilt, but her book, and a new round of pressure that came from Lorenzen's friends and family after the book was published, led police to re-examine Shara as a potential suspect. As Lorenzen's ex-wife, she had always been a person of interest in the case, but police never felt like they had any evidence tying her to the crime. But once the investigation was relaunched in full, Memphis police received direct help from the FBI, and both agencies focused their energy on people directly connected to Shara. And in 2017, 7 years after Lorenzen's murder, investigators spoke to a woman who had babysat Shara's children on several occasions, and that woman told investigators that she had once overheard Shara say that she had gotten rid of a gun by throwing it into a lake outside of the city. And so, an FBI dive team searched a lake that fit that description, and they found a 9mm pistol in the water that ended up matching the shell casings that had been found near Lorenzen's body. And that gun led investigators to the man from Shara's church who had pulled the trigger. And eventually, that man led them directly to Shara and exposed her involvement in her ex-husband's murder. The man who actually killed Lorenzen was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison plus 41 years. Shara signed a plea deal, and as part of that deal, she was convicted of facilitation of first-degree murder and was only sentenced to 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years. In January of 1997, a very accomplished and Ivy League-trained American chemist named Karen Wetterhahn started experiencing tingling in her lower extremities. Now, it was uncomfortable, but it wasn't enough discomfort to warrant going to a doctor or really being concerned about it. She figured it was just something kind of minor and it would go away on its own. But shortly after this tingling began, Karen started noticing she was having balance issues. She would be walking down the hallway at the university where she worked when inexplicably she would just lose her balance and start stumbling and would either fall to the ground or would have to lean up against the wall to steady herself. She tried to convince herself that she was just being clumsy or that she was just really tired and that's what was causing it. But shortly after these balance issues presented themselves, Karen was hit with a host of other health issues. Her speech became awkwardly slow and slurred. She began hearing this white noise ringing in her ear that just wouldn't go away. And her field of vision drastically narrowed to the point where it was like she was looking through 2 toilet paper rolls. Karen's husband brought her to the hospital where she underwent this very lengthy and involved examination, which involved spinal taps and brain scans to try to figure out what was going on because at first, none of the doctors had any idea. After the testing was complete and Karen was sleeping in a hospital bed and her husband was sitting by her side, a doctor walked into the room with a clipboard and he had this odd look on his face, like the news he was about to deliver he didn't really even understand. And so he consulted his clipboard one more time, looking at some paperwork, and then he looked up and he looked at Karen, and then he turned to Karen's husband, and he just says to him, "Sir, does your wife have any enemies?" It would turn out Karen was suffering from a severe case of mercury toxicity. Mercury is a naturally occurring metallic element that is poisonous to humans in all its forms. And Karen had so much mercury in her body, in fact, she had 80 times the toxic threshold, that doctors believed this had to have been an intentional poisoning, that someone must have attacked Karen trying to kill her with mercury. But Karen's husband said, I don't think my wife has any enemies. And then when Karen ultimately woke up, she reiterated that sentiment, that she did not have any enemies. The doctors, who knew Karen was a chemist, they asked her, have you had any recent exposure to mercury? And through slurred and difficult to understand speech, Karen would say that she had. In fact, over the last 6 months leading up to this hospital visit, Karen had had lots of exposure to mercury. because she was actually in charge of this huge $7 million research project that was looking to investigate the effects certain metals had on human health, and one of the metals she was studying was mercury. But Karen assured the doctor that anytime she handled any of these metals, she was always very, very cautious, especially when she handled mercury because she understood how hazardous it was. She said she always wore the proper protective equipment to make sure none of these substances made contact with her skin, and she worked under this big chemical hood, which is like a big vacuum, to ensure she didn't accidentally inhale any of the toxic fumes that came off of these metals. The doctor was totally stumped and went silent for a second, and then Karen at some point broke the silence by saying, well, there was one time I did have a spill with mercury, but it was totally meaningless, and I haven't thought about it until just now, only because we're trying to figure out what happened. She would go on to tell the doctor about an incident that occurred 5 months earlier. She had been working at her lab at the university where she was employed when she accidentally spilled 1 or 2 tiny droplets of mercury onto the top of her left hand near her thumb. Now, she was wearing all of the prescribed protective equipment, including latex gloves on her hand, and so when she saw these droplets on her hand, she wasn't concerned for her health, she just followed procedure. She stopped what she was doing, she wiped the droplets off, and then she left her workstation, she threw away the contaminated gloves, she thoroughly washed her hands, and then put new gloves on, and then just went back to work and didn't think much of it. The type of mercury that Karen had spilled on her hand was called dimethylmercury. This is not the same thing as the shiny silver liquid we see in old thermometers. That is a hazardous substance, but it's nothing compared to dimethylmercury. Dimethylmercury is a clear liquid that is considered to be one of the most toxic substances on the planet. After hearing this story from Karen, the doctor agreed that overall this did seem like a kind of meaningless event because she had followed all the proper procedures and those droplets had landed on her gloves, not on her skin. But since they had no other leads to operate on, he thought it would still be a good idea to test to see if dimethylmercury could penetrate through latex. And sure enough, after they ran some studies, they found it could. In fact, the latex gloves that all these scientists were told to wear when handling this particular substance, they did nothing. The dimethylmercury would penetrate through the latex in seconds. But even though they had just solved the mystery of how Karen got mercury toxicity in the first place, what no one could understand was why Karen was still suffering from the effects of mercury toxicity if her only exposure to it was 5 months earlier, just that one time. Typically, people who have mercury toxicity, they will get better as soon as the source of their toxicity is removed. Meaning, when the mercury goes away, they get better. And it's because the mercury kind of pools in their bloodstream and their body will naturally excrete it and they'll get better. But unfortunately for Karen, it would turn out dimethylmercury is a little bit different. It's far more lipophilic than other types of mercury. Lipophilic means a chemical substance is more likely to bind and mix with fat tissue in the body. And since blood is primarily made of water, when dimethylmercury enters the body, it does not settle in the bloodstream. Instead, it settles in organs that are made up of primarily fat. And once dimethylmercury is in your organs, it takes an exponentially longer amount of time for your body to excrete it, if it ever does. Sometimes you just die from the effects of mercury toxicity before your body can get rid of it. And in Karen's case, when she showed up to the hospital, it was already too late. Some of the dimethylmercury had already made its way up to her brain, which is an organ made up of 60% fat, and there it began to destroy her central nervous system. 3 weeks after being admitted to the hospital, Karen fell into a coma, and then shortly after, one of Karen's friends was in the hospital visiting her, and she saw a tear was coming down Karen's face. And so the friend turned to the doctor and said, is she in pain? Is that why she's crying? And the doctor said, no, it doesn't appear her brain is able to register pain anymore. Karen would unfortunately never wake up from her coma. She would pass away on June 8th, 1997, roughly 10 months after those little droplets of dimethylmercury landed on her latex glove. The next and final story of today's episode is called Unknown Unnatural Hazard. Before sunrise on August 22nd, 1986, a man named Ephraim Che woke up feeling groggy and confused. As he lay in his bed inside of his small mud brick house perched up on a cliff, he tried to remember what happened the night before. He didn't know why, but he knew, something happened last night. I gotta remember it. But as he lay there kind of jogging his memory, he felt like there were holes in his memory, like he couldn't quite piece together what had happened the day or night before. However, there was one thing he distinctly remembered about the night before, and that was at some point he had heard one really loud boom of thunder outside. And Ephraim, kind of somewhere in the back of his mind, had thought, oh, it's going to rain tonight, and maybe when I wake up it'll still be raining. And then Ephraim, no matter how hard he focused, he couldn't really remember how much time passed after hearing that booming sound and then getting in his bed the night before. But at some point, he remembered being in his bed and feeling kind of sick. And that was it. That was his whole memory of the night before. And so that morning, August 22nd, when Ephraim has suddenly woken up feeling confused, he rolled over and he looked out the window right nearby his bed, and he looked outside and he saw the sky was clear and the grass was totally dry. There was no indication that it had rained anytime recently. And so Ephraim is thinking to himself, something is definitely off here, but I just can't get my mind right. And so finally, Ephraim just sits up in his bed, he swings his legs out of his bed onto the ground, he stands up and practically falls over once he's on his feet. But he eventually gets himself back up, kind of steadies himself, and then he thinks, okay, I need to go check on my 4 kids and make sure they're okay. But the second Ephraim began to move in his house, it was like his body didn't obey his mind. Because moments later, instead of checking on his kids, Ephraim had wandered out his front door and was just standing out in front of his house, just kind of staring off into the distance, having no idea why he walked out there. The village where Ephraim lived was called Nyos, and Nyos is extremely rural. There's no electricity, there's no running water, and there's no paved roads for miles. The village is actually split into 2 parts. There's Upper Nyos and Lower Nyos. Ephraim lived in Upper Nyos, right near this big, beautiful lake called Lake Nyos, but the majority of villagers lived in Lower Nyos, which was below the lake. So that morning, after Ephraim kind of found himself standing outside of his hut for no reason, he began looking around in hopes that other people would be out and about in Upper Nyos, where he lived, so he could go talk to them and try to figure out what was wrong with him or, what was going on generally. But as he scanned around Upper Nyos, he saw there was not another soul anywhere. He was it. He was the only person walking around. So, without giving it much thought, Ephraim decided he would just start walking down towards Lower Nyos to try to talk to someone down there. And so he left his hut and he began walking down the hill that would take him to Lower Nyos. After Ephraim got about halfway down this hill, right when he was near Lake Nyos, he stopped because suddenly he became totally aware of the fact that the world was totally silent. Normally, the baboons in the nearby forest would be barking and insects would be humming and birds would be chirping, but now it was just completely, totally silent. Even the mosquitoes that were a totally annoying constant in Ephraim's life were gone. It was like the entire world had just shut down. And as Ephraim is looking around, wondering what is going on here, he hears off to his right, over near the lake, a woman shrieking at the top of her lungs. And so Ephraim whipped his head in the direction the screams were coming from, and he saw there was this woman about 100 feet away. She was a local, and she was looking right at Ephraim, and she was barely dressed, and she was ripping the rest of her clothes off, and she was just screaming. And so acting on instinct, Ephraim immediately turned and just started running towards this woman. And as he's bounding towards her, getting closer and closer, he's starting to notice there's these strange shapes on the ground kind of near this woman. But as he was staring at them, he just couldn't quite place what they were. But when he got about 20 feet away from this shrieking woman, he stopped again
because he realized the shapes on the ground were this woman's entire family. They were all just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. And near them was all of their cattle, also just laying on the ground as if they were sleeping. But as Ephraim stared at each of these people and each of these animals on the ground, he saw there was some blood around their noses and their mouths, and he realized no person who's sleeping would be that still. These people are all dead. These animals are all dead. And so standing there, Ephraim turned his attention from the bodies back to this woman who had dropped to her knees, and she was grabbing her father's arm and yanking on it and screaming for him to please wake up. But Ephraim could tell there was nothing she could do. Everyone was gone. And Ephraim knew somewhere deep down that, he's supposed to go over and help this woman or console her. But suddenly this wave of fear came over him, the combination of having no idea what's going on, his mind really wasn't working still, and now seeing all these dead people, it was like he just couldn't handle it. And so even though he felt terrible about this, Ephraim took one last look at this very distraught woman and her deceased family, and he turned and he ran away. And when he got back to the main trail, he continued downhill in the direction of Lower Nyos. The villagers in Lower Nyos lived in these tiny huts with tin roofs that were closely grouped together, and usually, even early in the morning, Lower Nyos was a very happy and lively place with kids running around and animals walking in the road and music playing. But as Ephraim came down the hill and was within earshot of Lower Nyos, it was deadly silent. And so with panic starting to rise inside of Ephraim, he began to run at full speed, hoping that when he turned the corner and looked down the main road of Lower Nyos, he would see the people he was hoping he would see. But when he turned the corner and looked down Main Street, all he saw were dead animals everywhere. They completely covered the streets, the sidewalk, everything. And so at this point, Ephraim was so desperate to see another person that he kept his eyes looking straight ahead so as not to look at all the dead animals, and just ran straight into Lower Nyos, and he turned towards the first hut he saw, and he ripped the door open and he stepped inside, and as soon as he did, he just stopped. Because on the ground right in front of him was a woman who was very clearly deceased, just laying in the middle of the floor. She had a bowl of corn right near her hand as if she had been eating and then just fell dead. And so Ephraim, he's staring at this dead woman, and then he looks up and he realizes the bedroom is right in eyesight, and he can see her family in their beds. And at first, Ephraim thought, oh, they're sleeping. But then as he continued to stare through the doorway into this room, he saw none of them were moving. Their chests were not going up and down from breathing. Her whole family, they were dead too. At this, Ephraim kind of stumbled backwards out of the hut, and then he turned around to face the road he had just been on with all the animals. And when he saw the road again, it was like a piece of his brain started working properly again, because he realized those weren't animal bodies. All those bodies he saw when he came in, those were people. Yes, there were some animals, but most of them were people. He could see people slumped on top of each other, kind of piled up in doorways. He saw one person who was on his motorcycle in the middle of the road, just slumped over his handlebars. And many of the bodies were either naked or partially clothed, with piles of clothing next to them, as if they had been trying to rip their clothes off as fast as they could, like the woman up at the lake had been doing. And as Ephraim looked around in horror, he also realized that there were no markings or cuts or wounds on any of these people. It was like they were just going about their lives when suddenly they died. And so without anything else to do, Ephraim just continued to walk in the direction he had come into the village, hoping that if he kept on going, he might run into someone who was alive. And so he begins walking down the road, he's stepping over bodies, he has no idea what to make of this, and then way down the road, up ahead, he sees there are two people coming towards him. There's a man and what looks like his son, and they're jogging down the road, stumbling over bodies, running towards Ephraim. And so Ephraim stops, expecting these people are going to stop and talk to him, But as these two people got closer, Ephraim saw both of them, the father and the son, their eyes were wide and they were looking straight ahead with kind of a distant 1,000-yard stare, and they didn't stop for a second for Ephraim. It was like they didn't even see him. They just kept on running down the road, past all the bodies. Ephraim didn't try to stop them. He just watched as they passed. And then at some point, they veered off the road and ran into the forest and disappeared. And it was at this moment that another part of Ephraim's brain seemed to kind of fit into place. Because as he watched this father and son disappear, he suddenly had this memory come flooding back into his mind. And it was a memory of when he was a kid and his grandfather told him a story. And the story was about Nyos villagers a long, long time ago who decided they wanted to cross Lake Nyos from one side to the other. And so their leader magically parted the waters of Lake Nyos, creating a walkway on the lake bed from one side to the other, and the villagers began to walk. And then, about halfway across, a mosquito landed on the leader's shoulder, and when he went to slap the mosquito, he lost control of the waters and they came crashing down and drowned all of them. Ephraim's grandfather told Ephraim that the ghosts of these drowned villagers now resided between these two big rocks located near Lower Nyos. And so growing up, Ephraim, along with many other people in this village, believed that because of these ghosts, Lower Nyos must be haunted. And in fact, that was actually why Ephraim built his house in Upper Nyos, to avoid these ghosts. And so now, as this memory of hearing this story from his grandfather has come flooding back to Ephraim, he thinks to himself, of course, all of this is the work of those ghosts. And so fearing he would be attacked next, Ephraim turned and just continued running down the road, dodging bodies as he went. And as he ran along, periodically he would stop at various tin huts and he would fling the door open in hopes he would find some survivors. But each time he went inside, everybody in there would be dead, lying in their beds or sitting in chairs or lying on the ground. But after running for quite a while, Ephraim turned to go into yet another hut, and right as he reached for the door opened on its own. And standing in front of him was the owner of this hut. His name was Joseph Naquain, and he was in much worse shape than Ephraim. The night before, Joseph had been inside of his hut when suddenly outside he heard that very loud booming sound that sounded like thunder to Ephraim. And then after hearing the sound, Joseph heard his daughter in her bed making this terrible snoring sound. And so instinctively, Joseph turned to walk over to his daughter to make sure she was okay, but he only got a few steps before he collapsed to the ground. He had woken up that morning with cuts all over his arms from where he fell, and he was also totally exhausted and very confused like Ephraim, and so he managed to drag himself over to his daughter's bed, and he pulled himself up onto her bed, and when he got up there, he realized his daughter was deceased. And so now Joseph has opened the door and he's looking out, and there's all these dead people everywhere, and Ephraim is looking back at him, and Joseph just can't process anything. He's just standing there in a total daze, and Ephraim, he wanted to say something, but no words could come out. And so he too just stood there looking at Joseph. And the two men just stood there right on the threshold of this hut, staring at each other, saying nothing for several minutes, until finally they both just extended their hands and shook silently. And then Ephraim turned around and ran back into the road. And so Joseph at first followed Ephraim kind of out of instinct, but very quickly he veered off from Ephraim, and Joseph went into his neighbor's hut to see if they were okay. But when he opened the door and went inside, he saw all of his neighbors were deceased. But Joseph, he barely reacted to this. It was like he was so numb to what was going on, he just couldn't process it. But after seeing all of his neighbors dead, somewhere deep down inside of his consciousness, Joseph knew he had to go find help. That was his mission. And so he left his neighbor's hut, he ran back to his own hut, he climbed onto his motorcycle, and he started to drive. It took Joseph a long time to drive to the next closest village, but when he got there were people, and they were all alive. And so Joseph tried to tell them what had happened in his village, But Joseph just had such a hard time putting his thoughts together that his sentences just didn't make sense. He was kind of incoherent. And then when he did make sense, the things he was talking about, an entire village just suddenly dying, sounded crazy. And so nobody at this other village took Joseph seriously. And so that day, nobody from this other village went to Nyos to see what was going on. But the next day, people from this other village did go to Nyos. And when they got there, it was exactly as Joseph had said. The whole village was dead. And as authorities would soon find out, it was not just Nyos that was affected by this tragic event. Several villages not far from Nyos had also suffered mass casualty events on the morning of August 22nd, 1986. And soon, news of these strange mass death events in West Africa were making the news all over the world. And so on August 25th, 3 days after this terrible event, an American scientist named Joseph Devine turned on his TV and saw the news coming out of West Africa. The newscasters were totally baffled about how this could have happened, and no one can figure out what killed these people. And Devine is just staring at his TV in shock. And then he turns, runs to his phone, and he calls his contact at the US government and told them, "You gotta send me to Nyos." And because his contact knew Devine's background, he immediately said, "Yes, I'll get you on a flight as soon as we can." Devine and his scientific partner, Haraldur Sigurdsson, arrived in Nyos 2 days later on August 27th. When they got there, they saw the military was burying the dead in these huge mass graves, and looking on were the few survivors of this event, like Joseph and Ephraim. Along with Ephraim's family, they also survived, as well as other villagers who had come to see what happened. And so as Devine and Sigurdsson kind of maneuver their way through this crowd of very solemn people, they heard them talking about what they thought happened to all these people. And the theories ranged from secret governmental experiments to invisible superweapons to even atomic explosions. Others, like Ephraim, believed this was paranormal, that those ghosts from the drowned villagers had attacked the village. But Devine and Sigurdsson were reasonably sure that none of those theories were correct. They felt like they did know what actually happened because they had actually witnessed a tragedy like this before, but on a much smaller scale. 2 years earlier, and 60 miles south of Nyos, in an area called Lake Manoon, 37 people suddenly dropped dead. And Devine and Sigurdsson had been sent out there to try to figure out what happened to these people, and after lots of experimentation, they came up with a theory that explained what happened, and they called it unknown unnatural hazard. They tried to warn people in the area that this could happen again, and in fact, Sigurdsson had written an entire scientific paper about this theory and submitted it to a prestigious science journal. But nobody took Devine or Sigurdsson seriously. What they were proposing sounded made up, it sounded preposterous. But now, in Nyos, it looked very much like their unknown, unnatural hazard had happened again. Devine and Sigurdsson would leave the group of people watching this mass burying take place, and they would make their way up the hill to Lake Nyos, where they would immediately get to work taking water samples from deep inside the lake. And after capping these samples, the lids began popping off. And that was the moment that Devine and Sigurdsson knew their unknown, unnatural hazard theory had to be correct. Lake Nyos is not your typical lake. It is a crater lake, which means it sits inside of a volcanic crater, which is a big, deep, bowl-like pit that was formed from a past volcanic explosion. And because of this volcanic activity, there is carbon dioxide in Lake Nyos. A lot of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, or CO2 for short, is an odorless, invisible gas that we actually breathe out when we exhale. Now, if you inhale a little bit of CO2, that won't hurt you. If you inhale a little bit more, like a medium amount of CO2, you could feel dizzy and nauseous, your skin will start to feel like it's on fire, you'll have rapid breathing. It'll be horrible, but you'll most likely survive if you stop breathing CO2. And if you breathe in a ton of CO2, you're dead. The CO2 in Lake Nyos had been trapped at the bottom of the lake for as long as anyone knew. But on the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened that caused that trapped gas to be released. Now remember, on that night, August 21st, Ephraim recalled hearing what he thought was thunder outside, and also Joseph would recall hearing a loud booming sound that night. Now, we don't know exactly what that sound was, but it's safe to say that that noise, whatever it was connected to releasing the gas. Maybe it was the sound of a rock slide and big rocks plummeted into the lake and hit the lake bottom and freed the gas that way. Or maybe it was just an actual volcanic eruption inside of the lake. Whatever it was, when the CO2 was freed, it bubbled to the top like it bubbled and popped off the lids of their sample tubes, and when it reached the top of the water, it kind of formed a cloud above the lake. Now, we can't see the cloud, but you can imagine a big cloud, and then this toxic CO2 cloud kind of rolled its way down the hill towards Lower Nyos and other villages in the area. And when this big toxic cloud began coming in contact with people, with animals, and insects, virtually all of them died. As for the few who survived, like Ephraim and his family and Joseph, they were left feeling horribly confused, disoriented, nauseous, totally dizzy from CO2 poisoning. But when they finally were able to get away from Nyos and breathe fresh air, the effects of CO2 poisoning wore off and they were okay. This deadly CO2 phenomenon was exactly what happened on a much smaller scale 2 years earlier at Lake Manoon. It was the unknown unnatural hazard that Devine and Sigurdsson had tried to warn people about. The official death toll of the Lake Nyos disaster was more than 1,700 people and more than 3,500 livestock, although exact numbers will likely never be known. Today, people have moved back into Upper and Lower Nyos, including Ephraim, despite the fact that authorities have said that lake is still very dangerous and another unknown unnatural hazard, aka a CO2 disaster, could absolutely happen again.
All the walls are breathing slowly. Cracks like rivers trace the night. Shadows fold around the memory of a love that wouldn't die. I hear your name inside the static, a ghost that moves beneath the glass.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like these, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So